Welcome to our deep dive into the world of microservices. We're going to take a look at how they work, what they're good for, and maybe uncover some potential issues too.
It's really interesting how microservices change how we build software. It's like, imagine a really big machine, one that does everything. But if one part breaks, the whole thing stops.
So that's like the old way, the monolithic applications. What makes microservices different?
Instead of that one huge machine, you have lots of smaller services all working together. Kind of like a team where each member does something specific but can help each other out if needed. And a big thing here is that if one service fails, the others can keep going.
That sounds really useful for keeping things up and running. It's like a backup generator for your software. Is that what fault tolerance means?
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just about fault tolerance. Since each service is independent, you can update or scale just that one without affecting the whole application. No more shutting everything down for a small update.
That's really smart, like changing a tire on a car, instead of rebuilding the whole engine for a small fix. I read about how the Guardian website uses microservices for things like their Olympics coverage. How does that work?
The Guardian is a perfect example of how flexible microservices can be. They can add or remove features as they need to, like for those special events, without messing up the rest of their website. That way, they can react quickly to changes. Like during the Olympics, they probably added some extra services to handle all the traffic and specific content, and then just remove them after. No big system changes needed.
So it's not just about keeping things running, it's also about adapting fast. But wouldn't all those separate services be harder to manage than just one big application?
You're right. That's an important thing to think about with microservices. Each service might be simpler, but the whole system can get more complex. Now you're dealing with a whole network of parts, which needs a different way of thinking and the right tools.
So there's a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
You get flexibility and resilience, but you have to handle that extra complexity.
Yeah, that's why you really need to think about the good and the bad and decide if microservices are the right fit for your specific needs. They're not a magic fix for every problem.
Okay, so maybe they're not always the answer, but they seem like a really powerful tool when used the right way. We've talked about the technical side, but I'm interested in how microservices change how teams work and are structured.
That's really important. Often, microservices come with a change in the way teams are organized. Instead of having teams focused on specific tech, like the user interface or the database, you have teams that own a whole business function. That end-to-end ownership can really change things.
So instead of a database team, you might have a customer management team that handles everything about customers, no matter what tech is involved.
Exactly. This way, the team understands the business needs better and feels more ownership. They're responsible for everything about their service, from building it to deploying it and keeping it running.
It sounds like it could make teams more efficient and focused. But wouldn't this also make teams more isolated? If each team is so focused on their own part, how do you make sure everyone is working together?
That's a good point, and it shows how important clear communication and collaboration are. Teams might have more autonomy, but they still need to align with the overall business goals. That means you need transparency, shared knowledge, and clear interfaces between services.
So it's not just about splitting up the tech, it's also about breaking down those organizational silos and working together more. I like that. Now, we've been talking about these independent services, but how do they actually talk to each other? It can't be as simple as just connecting them like Lego bricks, right?
Well, while Legos are a good way to picture the modularity, the communication between microservices is a bit more, well, nuanced. The key is what we call smart endpoints and dumb pipes.
Smart endpoints and dumb pipes. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means keeping the communication between services as simple as possible. Each service knows what it needs to do, and the communication channels just deliver the messages. Like sending a letter. You address it, put it in the mailbox, and the postal service does the rest. You don't need to know the exact route or how the postal system works.
So no complicated central system controlling everything. Each service handles its own logic and talks to the others in a clear, consistent way.
Exactly. That makes the system more flexible and easier to manage because the services are loosely coupled.
Makes sense. So each microservice is like its own little kingdom with clear borders and responsibilities. But if everything is decentralized, how do you keep things organized? Doesn't that lead to chaos?
That's where decentralized governance comes in.
So no more top-down rules and strict standards. Everyone just does their own thing.
Not exactly. It's more about working together and sharing responsibility rather than having strict control. It's about letting teams make decisions and solve problems on their own while still following general principles and good practices.
So finding a balance between autonomy and alignment.
Precisely. You create an environment where teams can innovate and experiment while still working towards a common goal. And talking about different approaches, what about data management in a world of microservices?
So if each microservice is like its own little kingdom, does that mean each one has its own separate database too? How do you manage data across all these independent services?
Great question, and it brings us to one of the most exciting things about microservices: polyglot persistence.
Polyglot persistence. Sounds complicated.
It's just a fancy term, but the idea is simple. It means each service can pick the type of database that works best for it. Think of a chef with different knives, each for a specific task.
So instead of trying to fit everything into one database, you can use different ones for different purposes, depending on the data and how you need to use it.
Exactly. You could have one service using a relational database for structured data, another using a NoSQL database for flexible data, and another using a graph database for relationships. It's all about choosing the right tool for the job and making each service work best for what it needs to do.
This all sounds really flexible and powerful, but I gotta say, it also sounds a little overwhelming. Managing all these separate services and databases, making sure they talk to each other right, keeping the data consistent, it seems like there's a lot that could go wrong.
You're not wrong. Moving from a monolith to microservices is a big change, and it definitely has its challenges. We've talked about some already, like the increased complexity and the need for good teamwork.
So what are some other things to watch out for when you're thinking about using microservices? What are some of the potential problems?
One of the biggest challenges is managing how all the services interact. Each service might be simpler on its own, but the whole system can become more complex because there are so many moving parts. It's like coordinating a fleet of delivery trucks instead of just one big truck. You need to make sure they're all going to the right places, communicating properly, and staying on schedule.
That's a great way to put it. So it's not just the tech itself, it's also about having the right processes and tools to handle all that complexity.
Absolutely. And another challenge is that microservices need a different set of skills and a new way of thinking. Teams need to be okay with making decisions independently, communicating asynchronously, and dealing with failures gracefully.
So it's not just knowing how to code, it's understanding how to design, build, and operate these systems where everything is distributed. Seems like a lot to learn.
It can be, but it's also really rewarding. The benefits of microservices, like being agile, scalable, and resilient, can be huge.
This has been a really helpful overview of microservices. We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive.
We've gone over the key features, the benefits, and some of the things to consider.
And we've also touched on how microservices impact teams, data management, and the complexity of the system.
But before we move on, I want to leave you with something to think about.
A cliffhanger.
Yeah.
I'm listening.
Think about this. How could these ideas of breaking down complexity, being independent, and embracing change apply to things beyond software?
That's interesting. So it's not just about building better software. It's about applying these ideas to other parts of our work and lives.
Exactly. How could you break a complex problem you're facing into smaller, more manageable pieces? How could you give individuals and teams the power to make decisions and take ownership?
Wow, there's a lot to think about there. Maybe we can explore that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. We'll dig deeper into what microservices mean in practice and look at some real-world examples of how companies are using them to do amazing things.
Sounds good. Until then, keep thinking about it. We're back, and I'm really interested in that question you left us with about how these microservices ideas can apply to more than just software.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating to think about. Take smart endpoints, dumb pipes. That wasn't just about computers talking to each other.
Right, you said it was like having a clear address on a letter, making sure it gets delivered. So how does that work with something like, say, teamwork?
Or imagine if you apply that same clarity to how people communicate within a team or even a whole organization. Instead of relying on all these complicated hierarchies where information can get lost or messed up, you focus on having clear, direct ways for individuals to talk to each other. Each person becomes a smart endpoint, they know what they're doing and what they're responsible for. And the communication itself is like the dumb pipe, just making sure the message gets through.
So instead of having to go through all these layers of bureaucracy, people can just get the information they need and make decisions faster. That does sound like you could save a lot of time and energy. But wouldn't that mean management has to trust people a lot more?
Absolutely. Just like with microservices, this kind of decentralized communication really depends on trust and a change in how people think. It's about empowering individuals, getting people to work together, and making sure everyone feels responsible.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea. Microservices aren't just about how the tech is set up, they're also about changing how we work and organize ourselves.
Exactly. And that brings us to another concept we can learn from: evolutionary design.
That's the idea of constantly adapting the software based on new information, right? Instead of just sticking to the original plan no matter what.
Precisely. It's about accepting that things change and seeing the system as something that's always evolving. But this idea goes beyond just lines of code.
Let me guess. It applies to personal growth too.
Think about it. Instead of thinking our skills and knowledge are fixed, we can approach them in that same evolutionary way. Break down our goals into smaller steps, try different things, and constantly learn from the feedback we get.
So instead of getting discouraged when we hit a roadblock, we see it as a chance to adapt and get better. We're basically constantly improving ourselves, just like you would with a software service.
That's a great way to put it. And just like in software, this makes us more adaptable and resilient when we face challenges. But let's not forget about the connection back to software development. This is super important for teams too. Being able to quickly change a service when users want something new, or the market shifts, gives companies a big edge.
Okay, I see how these ideas all connect. We've talked about communication, teamwork, and even personal development, but you mentioned even bigger implications. How do microservices fit into the bigger picture?
When we zoom out and look at society as a whole, we can see these principles popping up in different ways. Think about the concept of modularity, breaking down complex systems into smaller, independent parts.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. We have things like the gig economy, where people offer their skills independently, and remote work, where people can work from anywhere.
Right. And on the tech side, we have blockchain technology creating these decentralized systems where you don't need to trust a central authority. These are all examples of how those microservices principles are starting to change how we interact and organize ourselves.
So these technical concepts from software could actually influence things on a much larger scale. That's a pretty big idea to think about.
It definitely makes you think, right? It suggests this shift towards modularity, independence, and decentralization is happening everywhere, and microservices are just one part of it.
Makes you wonder, are microservices driving this change, or are they just a result of it?
That's a good question. But one thing's for sure, these principles are having a big impact.
This is making me think about my own work. Could we use these ideas to make our projects more adaptable and resilient? I mean, we don't build software, but the basic principles seem relevant.
I think it's definitely worth exploring. Maybe you could break down a big project into smaller pieces, each with a clear owner. Or try making decisions in a more decentralized way.
Hmm, I like that. I'm already starting to see some ways we could try it. Okay, so we've gone from Legos to personal growth to the future of society. But let's bring it back to reality for a minute. We've talked a lot about the exciting possibilities, but what about the practical side of actually using microservices?
Yeah, we need to be realistic about the challenges. We talked about some earlier, like needing specialized skills and the fact that the system can get more complex.
Right, managing all those separate services and databases, making sure they talk to each other properly. It seems like a lot could go wrong.
There are definitely some potential problems to watch out for. For example, one common one is keeping the data consistent across all the services. If each service has its own database, how do you make sure the data is in sync and accurate?
That sounds tricky. It's like trying to manage a bunch of spreadsheets that are all linked together. What if someone updates one but forgets to update the others?
Exactly. That's why you need good data management strategies, like using eventual consistency models or things like distributed transactions.
So it's not just about breaking down the application, it's also about thinking carefully about how to manage the data across all those independent services.
Absolutely. And another challenge is security and making sure you follow the rules. With microservices, there are more places where things could go wrong. So you need strong security measures and make sure each service meets the required standards.
So security is even more important with microservices, not less.
Right. And we can't forget about the overhead of managing a system that's spread out. You need tools and processes for monitoring, logging, tracing requests, and figuring out what's wrong when there's a problem.
So you're saying that while microservices offer a lot of benefits, they also come with some baggage.
It's important to know what you're getting into. It's not a magic solution, and it's not right for every situation.
So how do you know if microservices are the right choice for a specific situation? What are some key things to consider?
There are several things to weigh. The size and complexity of your application are important. If it's fairly small and straightforward, a monolith might be better.
So don't overcomplicate things if you don't need to.
Exactly. But if you have a large and complex application that's always changing,
Mm.
microservices could be a good fit. You also need to think about how fast your business needs are changing.
So if things are changing quickly, you need a system that can keep up.
Right. Microservices are great when you need to be agile and flexible, and you need to look at the technical skills on your team.
Because microservices require different skills than working with traditional monolithic applications.
Absolutely. Teams need to be comfortable with distributed systems, asynchronous communication, and making decisions independently. And lastly, you need to consider how much risk your organization is willing to take.
Because microservices come with their own set of complexities and potential challenges.
Exactly. You need to be realistic about the risks and be ready to invest the time and resources to handle them.
Okay, so it sounds like microservices are a powerful tool, but not a magic solution. You have to carefully weigh the pros and cons and make sure it's the right fit for your situation.
Exactly. And even if you choose to go with microservices, it's important to have a good strategy. Don't try to do too much at once.
Start small, try things out, and gradually build your system over time.
That's the best way to minimize risk and make sure you're building a system that really meets your needs.
This has been a really insightful discussion. We've gone beyond just the technical details of microservices and talked about how they impact teamwork, personal growth, and even society as a whole.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it? From Lego bricks to blockchain, we've seen how these principles are shaping the world.
But as we talked about, it's important to approach microservices with a clear understanding of both the good and the bad.
They're not a perfect solution, but they're a powerful tool that can be used to create systems that are more adaptable, resilient, and innovative.
Now, in the final part, we'll look at some real-world examples of how companies are using microservices to do some pretty amazing things.
We'll look at case studies from companies like Netflix, Amazon, and Uber and see how they've used microservices to transform their businesses.
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll make these ideas more concrete with real-world examples and practical insights.
Until then, keep exploring and keep experimenting.
All right, welcome back for the final part of our microservices deep dive. I'm really excited to see how all of this works in real life.
It's one thing to talk about the theory, but seeing how actual companies are using microservices is where it gets really interesting. So how about we start with a company that's basically the king of streaming, Netflix.
Oh yeah, they went from mailing DVDs to changing how we watch everything. That's a pretty huge change. Did microservices have anything to do with that?
Definitely. Netflix was one of the first to use microservicing, and it's a big reason why they could scale their platform so fast and so well. They moved away from that big monolithic architecture and split their system into hundreds of separate microservices.
Hundreds. So like each little thing, like recommending a movie or taking a payment, is handled by its own service.
That's the idea. Each microservice has one specific job, and they all work together to make that seamless streaming experience we expect from Netflix.
So like, if the recommendations aren't working well one day, it doesn't take down the whole platform.
Exactly. That's one of the big advantages of microservices. If one service has a problem, it doesn't affect the rest. And this modular design also lets Netflix roll out updates and new features quickly and on their own without bothering the users.
So it's like having a bunch of specialists behind the scenes, each one focused on their own thing. But how do they get all those separate services to work together?
That's where things like service discovery, API gateways, and really good communication protocols come in. It's complicated to make it all work, but it allows Netflix to handle tons of traffic, personalize recommendations, and keep changing their platform. Think about those times when everyone is watching Netflix at the same time. Microservices let them scale up the parts that need it, like the streaming itself, without having to scale up everything.
Like a flexible team that can adapt to whatever's needed. Okay, so Netflix shows how microservices can work for a big tech company. But can other industries use these ideas too?
Of course, let's take Amazon, for example. We know them for their online store, but they're also huge in cloud computing. And just like Netflix, Amazon uses microservices to build their massive, complex systems.
Wow, a company that handles millions of products, sellers, and customers worldwide. How do microservices even work with something that big?
Think of Amazon's platform as a city with different districts, each one specializing in something. You have the shopping district, the shipping district, the payment district, and so on. Each of these districts is like a microservice, responsible for its own area.
So like if you order a book, it sets off a chain reaction between different microservices. The shopping district handles the order, shipping takes care of delivery, and payment processes the money.
That's it. And because each service is independent, Amazon can scale them separately depending on what's needed. During those busy shopping periods, they can easily increase the capacity of the shopping and shipping districts without touching the other parts of the system.
It's like a city that can grow and change easily, adding new areas or expanding the ones that are already there. And this modularity also lets Amazon try new things and innovate. They can release new features or services quickly and see how customers react without messing up the main platform.
Exactly. And it's not just about scale and efficiency. Microservices also help Amazon make the shopping experience feel more personal. By looking at your browsing history, what you've bought before, and what you like, they can recommend things just for you.
It's like having a personal shopper who knows exactly what you want. Okay, so we've seen how microservices work for these big e-commerce companies like Amazon, but what about other types of businesses, like transportation?
Let's look at Uber, a company that really changed the taxi industry. They depend a lot on microservices for their global ride-hailing platform.
So when I open the Uber app and ask for a ride, are microservices working behind the scenes?
Yep, every step of the way, from finding a driver nearby to figuring out the price and taking the payment, is handled by a network of connected microservices.
This is all happening really smoothly behind the scenes, with different services sending information back and forth. There's a service that connects riders and drivers, one that tracks the cars, one that figures out the route and how long it will take, and so on.
Exactly. And because these services are all independent, Uber can update or scale them separately. Imagine a lot of people suddenly need rides during rush hour. Uber can easily scale up the services that connect riders and drivers without affecting the other parts of the system.
It's like having a transportation system that can change based on traffic and demand.
Right. And this structure lets Uber work in hundreds of cities around the world, connecting millions of riders and drivers.
These examples, Netflix, Amazon, Uber, they all show what microservices can do. They've shown us how this approach can help companies become really big, really adaptable, and really resilient.
But it's important to remember that microservices aren't a one-size-fits-all solution. They come with their own challenges, and you need to think about software development in a different way.
We've talked about those challenges, things like the system becoming more complex, the need for specialized skills, and how important it is to manage data and security well.
The main takeaway is that microservices are a powerful tool, but not a magic fix. You need to plan carefully, be ready to learn and adapt, and be willing to embrace change.
Like any powerful tool, when you use it right, you can build amazing things. But if you're not careful, it can cause more problems than it solves.
That's a good way to put it. But for those who are willing to take on the challenges, the rewards can be huge. We're seeing companies in all kinds of industries using microservices to change their businesses, become more adaptable, and thrive in a world that's always changing.
This deep dive has been really insightful. We've explored how microservices work, how they affect teams and organizations, and even how they might change society.
It's been a great journey. We've gone from Lego bricks to blockchain and seen how these principles are shaping everything around us.
But as we've learned, it's important to approach microservices knowing both the good and the bad sides.
They're not a perfect solution, but they are a powerful tool that can help us build more adaptable, resilient, and innovative systems. And that wraps up our deep dive into microservices. We hope you've enjoyed learning about this incredible architectural style. Until next time, keep learning and keep innovating.